David Miliband. More than half of all maternal and child deaths are now in fragile settings. And not surprisingly, the nutritional status of these populations is falling further behind. And I think the trend is forecast to continue. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Has the global development community woken up to the need for a big health and nutrition push in fragile states? And what exactly should be done?
Well, thank you, Leith. It's a huge pleasure and privilege to be so outnumbered on this panel by extraordinarily informed, passionate, and expert women this evening. The short answer to your question is no, and it's interesting the way you framed the question. You talked about the global development community, and of course the divide between a development community and a humanitarian community. The humanitarians traditionally expected to take care of quote-unquote fragile states and people in fragile states is part of the problem, and the problem is expressed very clearly there. I'm going to openly be a stuck record tonight. I'm going to talk in every single answer I give about the changing geography of poverty in the world. When the Millennium Development Goals were founded 15 years ago, 12% of the world's extreme poor lived in fragile or conflict states. Today, it's 43%. On current trends, it will be 60%, 65% by 2030. And it's imperative, not just for the development community, but for the humanitarian community as well, to catch up with this changing geography of poverty. It's an urbanized population, not just a refugee camp population. It's a population living under armed opposition groups as well as living under states and governments. And I run an organization that tries to work on the sharp end of these conflicts that are producing 20 million refugees last year, 40 million IDPs, internally displaced people last year. And I'm so pleased Grassa used the statistic about the amount of stunting in Africa. The level of stunting in conflict states is twice the average level. And in a lot of fragile states and fragile communities, half the kids are undernourished. And for us as an agency that's trying to work at that sharp end, I just want to put on the table, and I'll come back to these points. Here are three reflections, not from me, but from the people who are actually doing the work. One is, how many times have you heard the expression in public policy, whether it be in rich countries or poor countries, there are some very difficult, hard-to-reach populations. It's a classic phrase. And I think we need a whole change of mindset. We need to think about hard-to-reach services, not just hard-to-reach populations. And the truth is that what we often call community services, that expect people to make 12 trips over 3 months to pick up their weekly food supplement, it's a hard-to-reach service, not a hard-to-reach population. And our experience in working against malaria, against diarrhea, against pneumonia with the community case management approach, where volunteers and workers in communities are used, is that they are many times more successful. And so I want to put on the table that for conflict populations and in fragile states, we need to expand the community case management approach that has been so successful on malaria to tackle some of the malnutrition issues. Second point, I'm new to this sector. I came to the humanitarian sector 2 years ago, and I exposed my ignorance to find that there is a global protocol on severe acute malnutrition, and it's different from the global protocol on moderate acute malnutrition. And in some places we've got programs for severe acute malnutrition, but no program for moderate acute malnutrition. And in other places, there's moderate acute malnutrition being tackled, but not severe acute malnutrition. That says to me that we've got a real problem. And that's why we at the IRC are trialing, including with some of the organizations represented on the panel, the idea of a combined protocol. And I want to come back later on in the discussion, but it seems to me that needs to be on the agenda if we're to organize our services around the lives that people lead rather than around the categories that we've developed for ourselves. And the final point I want to come back to later is something I feel very, very strongly about. There's going to be a huge amount of applause later this week for the new Sustainable Development Goals. But the question for us, I think, is how is that applause turned into action? And I was so pleased when I read this report to see accountability right there on the front page and right there running through each chapter. Because the truth is, applause doesn't get turned into action unless it goes through accountability. And frankly, my great fear about the inspiring Sustainable Development Goals is that for the 43% of the world's extreme poor who live in fragile states, there isn't yet an accountability mechanism for how their needs are going to be met. So if you're a woman being traumatized by violence in a conflict, there's no target for the services that are going to be available to you. If you're a kid in Lebanon, a Syrian kid in Lebanon, 300,000 Syrian kids in Lebanon have no education, there's no target there that says we're going to make progress in turning out-of-school kids into in-school kids in conflict situations. And as you read through the goals and the targets, there isn't the specificity that would speak to the needs of people in conflict situations. And I think that that is one way in which we can get accountability into the system. So you ask me, how can the fight against malnutrition adapt to this concentration of poverty in conflict settings? There are three issues I want to put on the agenda. One, are our services designed around ourselves, around the people that we're trying to help? Secondly, are our protocols specifically in respect of tackling malnutrition fit for purpose? And thirdly, how are we going to make sure that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, don't pass by the most vulnerable people, who are those who are caught in conflict?
Thank you, David.